1 Corinthians, chapter number 1. We'll be looking at verses 12 through 17 today. Now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, and I of Apollos, and I of Cephas, and I of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were ye baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you, but Crispus and Gaius, lest any should say that I had baptized in mine own name. And I baptized also the household of Stephanas. Besides, I know not whether I baptized any other. For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray you'd help me to preach in your power, not in my own. I pray that the hearers would be ready to receive, and that there would be a blessing in this message, that we would check our lives for carnal thinking. It's in thy Son's name I pray. Amen. So, can anybody tell me, since I've been away for a couple of weeks, given my globe-trotting nature, can anybody tell me what we discussed the last time I did Sunday school? Unity, very good. We dealt with unity, the beauty of unity, right? I figure I'd take a quick moment just to review some of the points that we had related to unity that Paul brought forth in that previous passage. We saw the meaning of unity, right? We saw that what Paul means by unity isn't what the world means by unity. It isn't everybody getting together around a campfire and singing Kumbaya and holding hands or some other nonsensical meaning of unity. It doesn't mean we put aside whatever beliefs the Bible tells us to hold in the interest of getting together with the congregational church down the street or the Catholic Church. No, that's not what unity means whatsoever. That's what the world would have us to believe unity means. But unity means that we're all going in the same direction. That the church is unified in obeying what the Bible has to say, right? We saw that there's a quality to the unity that we're supposed to have. It's not. We saw that that we're to be. Where is it? I can't find it now. That you in verse 10, we saw that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together. We saw that was the same Greek word that was used in Hebrews 11 to describe how God fitly framed the world, right? That's that same measure of the quality of the unity that we're to have in the church. We should be fitly framed together. We saw the responsibility of unity. Whose responsibility is it? Ours. It's mine. It's Mr. Boyer's. It's Mrs. Boyer's. It's Mrs. Webb's. It's Caleb's. It's all of ours individual responsibilities to get in line with the program, right? To do what the Bible has for us to do. Pastors are given to facilitate that, but ultimately the responsibility is for you to listen to that teaching and actually do the unity part. Whether that means putting yourself aside, whatever that means. And that leads me to the next point we saw was the cost of unity, right? Sometimes that means you got to do hard things. Sometimes it means you got to take hard stands. In the case of Chloe, I mentioned that, I would wager, given the state of the church that they were in at Corinth, that there were some people that probably would have looked at him and gone, "You tattletales. Why are you running off to Paul and saying all these things?" There was probably some reputation damage that they had to deal with. But I don't think the house of Chloe was that concerned about their reputation. They were more concerned about their character, what God thought of them. And we last saw the benefits of unity, right? We saw that there's peace when there's unity. When everybody's going in the same direction, there is peace. If everybody's going in their separate directions, if I've got my own agenda, I'm going to clash with somebody who's got a different agenda. We saw that there's power. When an army is moving in the same direction, there's power. It generates fear. When the Babylonians were coming down as an army, That struck some fear into the hearts of Judah, I'd say. But as we dive into this message, I've titled this Evidence of Carnal Thinking. This lack of unity that we discussed, or over these last couple of messages, because the week before was on divisions. This lack of unity is a symptom of something that Paul is also going to deal with, and that's worldly wisdom. We see this down, if you look down at in chapter 3, verse 3. For ye are yet carnal, for whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men? This is something that the world does, and I'll tie that back over here. If you look at verse 12, where are the divisions coming from? Now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, and I am of Apollos, and I of Cephas, and I of Christ. Every man is doing what is right in their own eyes, which I'll touch on here. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But starting from this point, from verse 12 on, Paul spends the next roughly 3.5 chapters delineating between worldly and godly wisdom, and the importance of sticking with godly wisdom. The folly of following after your own ways, doing what you think is right. And it's important to note, in verse 12, that the characters that the Corinthians were dividing themselves among were all good men, or even God, as the case may be, right? Paul was one of the greatest missionaries of the early church. Traveled the length and breadth of Europe, it's likely. It's possible he made it into Spain. There are rumors he was even up into Britain. He certainly had an outsized impact on spreading the gospel in the early church period. And if that weren't enough, he's responsible for writing a pretty substantial chunk of the New Testament on his own. And to boot, he had the scars to back up that he was the real deal, right? He had suffered a great many things for Christ, and typically when somebody has suffered that much, people are going to look up to you in one way or another, right? So he could be considered a martyr for his, he hadn't been killed yet, but he had suffered as a martyr a great many things for the cause of Christ at that time. So, good man. Paul's a very good man, one of the greatest. Apollos was a great speaker, right? He could be described as the follow-on to Paul. Paul himself describes Apollos as having watered. Paul planted, Apollos watered. He came after Paul and developed what Paul had already done. A man clearly mightily used of God. Cephas, in my opinion, he's the greatest of the original 12. Of the original 12 apostles. He was often acting as the spokesman. It was like if Christ asked a question, more often than not, it's Peter, for better or for worse, opening his mouth and speaking for the crew. He was a lion for the church in Jerusalem, fearlessly proclaiming the gospel in spite of his own set of beatings that would result from him. And then, of course, Christ. Christ, of course, should be the one we all claim to follow. I mean, we bear the name Christians, which means what? Little Christs, right? And ultimately, all of these men we should strive to follow. The key is we follow them as they follow Christ, not following just them because they're them, right? But instead, what we see is that there was an active choice by the Corinthian church to follow after divisions, right? Some chose Paul, perhaps because he was a great minister, he did great work in the ministry, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to say, I follow Paul? This great man of the faith. Who wouldn't want to say that they followed after Apollos, This man was apparently a great orator. I think if the Bible says you are a great orator, that must say an awful lot for your skill as a speaker. And being a great speaker is not bad. I myself have said, this person or that person can speak really, really well, right? And I think that pastors and teachers should try to improve their diction and manner of speaking. That's not a bad thing. But if that's all that a particular person is known for, particularly a pastor, that's a failure. That man is a failure. And choosing a man based on his ability to speak is how it literally goes right in line with what Pastor was talking about earlier, right? Simply choosing a man based on his ability to speak is how many an evil individual gains ascendancy both in the church and in the political world. I was born during the Clinton years. I don't really remember Clinton, but I've heard testimony that everybody thought he was a great speaker. Now, listening to recordings, and I admit I'm biased because I didn't like what Clinton did, but I never really saw what the appeal of Clinton speaking was. I'd never thought of him as a great orator. But people did, and people followed him. Obama, everybody thought Obama was like a great speaker. And I remember listening to him going, he ain't nothing special. Really, the last great orator I thought was Reagan. Reagan was like, that guy knew how to communicate. But if I just followed Reagan because he was a good speaker, where does that leave me? If Reagan says, well, maybe we'll make allowance for the Catholic Church or something like that, does that mean I'm just going to follow him? Because, wow, he orated that so well. And well, if Reagan says it, I'm going to do it. Well, no, that's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? And indeed, as Pastor said, the Antichrist is going to be a very suave man. That man is going to know how to work. He's going to be able to formulate his arguments, and he's going to have a great voice. And that man he's going to convince the world. And there's going to be people that are going to listen to him just because he can speak really well. And that's more or less the reason I think some of these Corinthians are following after Apollos. The man can speak well. I like that man because he thinks the way I think, and he can speak out at my brain speed or whatever. It's just it tickles my brain the way he's able to orate. But again, it's the wrong reasons. The wrong reason. Cephas, to this day, there's an entire religion built around following after Cephas, right? The popery is built around a succession, quote unquote, from Peter to the current pope. And again, you can see why they would want to follow after Peter. Great man of the church. And then those that claim Christ, Paul, the way Paul is framing this verse 12, an eye of Christ, they clearly didn't mean it. And actually, John Gill, I think, summed this up way better than I can, as relates to these people that claim that they were of Christ. These were for Christ in opposition to Paul, Apollos, and Cephas, and any other ministers of the word. They were for Christ without his ministers. They were wiser than their teachers. They were above being under any ministrations and ordinances. As the others attributed too much to the ministers of the gospel, these detracted too much from them, and denied them to be of any use and service. Some persons may be in such sense for Christ as to be blameworthy, as when they use his name to deceive men or divide his interest, which is exactly what's going on. I thought that was Gil really nailed it. Really nailed that description of these people who claim, eye of Christ. And indeed, I think it actually sums up the likely attitudes of many who take these tacks. I will do what I want. And it's convenient, right? Because if I choose to follow a man like Paul, or if I choose to follow a man like Cephas or Apollos, well, at any time that they say something I don't like, well, I can just claim, well, he's a man. He gets things wrong every now and then, and ultimately I'm right. And if I say, oh, I choose Christ, then I don't have to listen to what a man has to say. Because, well, I follow Christ. And if Paul says this and it doesn't line up with what I think, well, I'm following Christ, so I'm going to do what I think as opposed to what Paul told me to do. And clearly, I do want to say that just because these people were following them, these men, doesn't mean that they were bad characters. You know, people have done good things, like Wesley. Wesley was a good man. I don't think you can deny that he was a man used of God. But look at where his followers are today. The Methodist Church is it departed, and Ichabod was written above it a long, long time ago. We'll put it that way. But that doesn't mean that John Wesley was bad. His followers took great liberties, and I think he would be very disappointed at where his followers are today. But again, it's because they were following a man, ultimately. And then in verse 13, Paul lays out the ridiculousness of a divided Christ, right? You can hear the incredulity jumping off of the page as Paul reads this. Is Christ divided? This is a rhetorical question. Of course Christ isn't divided. Christ himself said regarding the devils that when the Pharisees accused him of casting out devils through the prince of devils, right, through Beelzebub, Christ said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. If the devils are here casting out devils, then Satan's in a lot of trouble, you know? And if the kingdom of darkness cannot stand being divided, how much less the kingdom of light? As we discussed several weeks ago, divisions never lend themselves to strength. And Paul now emphasizes the stupidity of the Corinthians following after men's wisdom. Was Paul crucified for you? Again, that's quite a rhetorical question, isn't it? Of course it wasn't. Why would you follow a man who didn't do the thing that saved you from your sins? Why would you follow after Cephas? You can put, Paul uses himself here as an example, but you could put was Apollos crucified for you? Was Cephas? The answer every time is absolutely not. Were we baptized in the name of Paul? That seems to be where the Corinthians are going, based off of how Paul handles the next few verses, where we see Paul was the real deal. Paul was not pursuing a following, right? This actually echoes a bit of John the Baptist. The Pharisees came to him and, art thou the Christ? John the Baptist, at that very moment, had the opportunity to basically have them in the palm of their hands. They wouldn't accept the actual Christ. But hey, if John the Baptist had said, yeah, I'm the Christ, they probably would have followed him. They probably would have believed him. What an irony. But no, John the Baptist says no. He bluntly says, I am not the Christ. And in a very similar manner, Paul here says, you're not supposed to be following me. Not in the sense that they are. Again, later on, Paul will say, "Be ye followers of me," but his context is very, very different. Paul has an opportunity to build a base here. Building a base is a very common and difficult political mission in these days, right? You're always looking for that group of voters who will always vote for you. You know, they're not going to swing. They're not questioning, well, you know, maybe this candidate or this candidate. No, you want a base, a good solid chunk of the electorate that will vote for you no matter what. And then you can go and maybe hem and haw. You can compromise a little bit, but you'll still keep that base of voters, right? Paul's not doing that. Paul already has a base to work with, it seems. And if Paul were out to define a legacy for himself, this was his opportunity to massage the church to boost his numbers, so to speak. But the problem is that Paul is not keeping track. And this is borne out in verses 14 through 16. I thank God that I baptized none of you but Crispus and Gaius, lest any should say that I had baptized in my own name. And I baptized also the household of Stephanas. Besides, I know not whether I baptized any other. He mentions two members he knows he baptized, Crispus and Gaius. And then, almost as an afterthought, like he forgot, he remembers another household he baptized. And then it's like, I don't know if I baptized any others. And ultimately, I don't care. Paul doesn't want to be associated with his divisions to the point that he thanks God he didn't baptize any of them, or many of them, rather. What a sad testimony that is for the Corinthian church. I mean, that would be kind of, I was thinking about this. This would be kind of like, I'll use Pastor Mitchell. Pastor Mitchell started this church, and I know we don't have any of the original members here, but let's just say that there were. We had some of the original members that perhaps Pastor Mitchell had baptized. Can you imagine Pastor Mitchell coming here and being thankful that he didn't baptize some of us because, we then were, trying to follow after him as a man? That would be a horrible testimony. And what a disappointment. How disappointed Pastor Mitchell would be. That's what Paul's feeling here. But at the end of the day, Paul sets an excellent example for us to ask why we do the things we do. Paul wasn't pursuing a following. But specifically, the temptation is here quite strong to have a following. Most of us want to be looked up to, right? Most of us want to be seen as competent, confident. We like having people come to us and ask us questions. To think that we might know something. That song, the "If I Were a Rich Man," where it says, if you're rich, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong because they think you really know. It doesn't matter one way or the other. I would wager that most of us, perhaps we wouldn't say it out loud, but most of us would like to be asked to be considered an expert on something, to be a leader, to have influence within a group. But just like Paul didn't desire that, neither should any of us. Our objective is not building a reputation here. So what is our mission? Well, if it's not to build up a reputation for ourselves, which, by the way, is kind of, again, at the end of the day, what's going to happen to this old world and any reputation we built up in it? What will be the legacy of Klaus Schwab at the end of the day? What will be the legacy of Donald Trump? What will be the legacy of Joe Biden, Barack Obama? Greater men than they have tried to leave their mark on history. I go back to Napoleon. Napoleon reshaped Europe as it was. He changed how militaries fought. He literally stood up and tore down dynasties. He's the man that's responsible, albeit indirectly, for the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. He made Austria, the Austrian monarchy, practically ineffectual. Man left his mark all over Europe. And yet, really? When I took history, I got world history, I got maybe a couple pages on Napoleon. That's it. Just a couple of pages, about that thick, that high. That's it. For a man that did that much. So with a true mission, of course, we see this in verse 17, for Christ sent me not to baptize. Now, of course, we are to baptize, right? Paul's not saying that we shouldn't baptize. As part of the Great Commission is to go into all the world, teach all nations, baptizing them, right? But here the context is baptizing believers into your camp, doing it to get a following for yourself. That the true mission is to preach the gospel. And it's such a simple thing. And again, I'm not gonna dive too deep into this. I will get into this more, because effectively that's where Paul goes, is the foolishness of preaching. You Corinthians think yourselves so wise. You think yourselves that you've got it all figured out. And Paul mocks them at times through these next couple of chapters, and rightfully so. but to preach the gospel. That's the simple objective. And how? How is this gospel to be done? Not with wisdom of words. Now, again, I'm going to say, I'm not saying we shouldn't study, and Paul's not saying that we shouldn't study and be familiar with methods of apologetics, argumentation, logic, and so on. We should be aware of those things. We should know them to a degree. But for all that, we have to be so careful not to be caught up with trying to preach the gospel using our methods, in our strength, or in our own wisdom. Why? Because what's the end result that Paul says at the end of that verse? That the cross of Christ be made of none effect. How frightening would that be? I have one word for this in modern English. It starts with a P. Any guesses? P-R-A. It's an ism. Pragmatism. Yep. Pragmatism is so prevalent in the churches of today. And we can see the very effects of the gospel of Christ being made of none effect. Easy believism. The idea that all somebody has to do is say a series of words in a certain order, and they're good to go. Talk about making the gospel of Christ of none effect. There's no change in their lives. They never do anything for Christ. They just continue to live on in their wicked ways. Indeed, they are made. This is one of the things that it was a number of years ago that convinced me how evil easy believism is because you are making them twofold more a child of hell by making them believe that they're all set because you had them pray a little prayer. They are all the more damned to hell because of what churches proclaim to do. And if that doesn't make you mad and think that that's wicked and evil, I don't know what will. Worldly music and, in general, entertainment in the church is another example of pragmatism working itself out in how churches preach the gospel through the wisdom of man. They think, well, if we appeal to their worldly lusts and their worldly appetites, well, we'll get them in, and then we'll preach the gospel to them. Right? A little worldly music, we can compromise a little bit on that just to get a few people in, and it's for a good purpose. The end justifies the means. I was looking up a song the other day I hadn't heard, and I was trying to see, hey, is this something we can listen to? And it was a group of guys all in suits and all that, and they were getting ready to perform the song, but the whole thing was all about entertainment. Every line was like you were at a comedy show instead of in a church. It was kind of like, this is what the world thinks is a good way of getting people into church to hear the gospel. Focus on kids programs. Right? These are all pragmatic methods that lean on the world's wisdom to preach the gospel. Paul says, not with wisdom of words. Something my dad used to say is, what you win them by is what you win them to. And are not the churches of America today prime examples of that very philosophy? Not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. I hope none of us would want to be guilty of making the cross of Christ of none effect. But yet, if we go out and we try to witness in our own strength, utilizing our own intellect, which, maybe it's substantial. Maybe some of us have good brains. God's maybe blessed you with a good brain. But ultimately, if you go about trying to witness out of your own strength and you circumvent what needs to be preached, you make the cross of Christ of none effect. Those words ought to scare you. Because that means, what now? That means we have a responsibility. Horrors. We have a responsibility to make sure that we're preaching the gospel the way God intended, not the way we think it should be preached. And again, Paul is going to start hitting us on this as we go through the next few verses. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us. It does look foolish, right? It does appear like a foolish mechanism. But it's the way God has ordained. And ultimately, if you don't believe that that's the way God's ordained things, you're not going to believe the rest of the Bible. Just not. So, as we'll be proceeding into more learning about the foolishness of man's wisdom, make sure that we're sticking to what the Bible has to say. That we're preaching the gospel as God intended it to be preached, not as we think it ought to be preached. Right? Let's close in word of prayer.